Hello, welcome.
Hello.
Yeah, we'll give you a little background on the Jews who end up in Missoula and the slow development of actually a community here in Missoula. In the 1870s, Butte and Helena were the big cities, and that's where the Jews were primarily in the state of Montana as well. There were a couple of early businessmen around 1880, a little before, a little bit after, who ended up in Missoula, who were actually fairly instrumental and important towards the development of Missoula, but particularly of the interest in the Jewish community. A fellow by the name of Jacob Leiser lost his fortune in Helena, went back to the Bay Area for a few years, got a little money again, and so the story goes that he walked from the Bay Area to Missoula. His daughter, Esther Leiser, was still living in the 1950. She died in 56 and is buried here. But her dad supposedly was the first Jew in Missoula. So my dad actually wrote a poem about this. So let me share his poem. The first Jew in Missoula. They typically came from far away, from across the Atlantic wide, to escape the fear of hunger or lash, to share Columbia's pride. One such was Jacob Leiser. From Germany, his home. After docking in New York City, said Jake, "No more shall I roam." But he was seeking adventure, so around the Horn he went, and landed in California. You'd think it was heaven sent. But Jacob Leiser was restless still, so off again with pack, he walked a long northeasterly way, said he, "There's no turning back." He lived off the bounties of nature, and many a native he met. After a long and arduous journey, he stopped at a place called De Smet. Jake put down his roots and opened a store in that well-watered, five-valleyed place in a spot now known to Missoula. Met the Salish face to face. The story is told by his daughter, described their dealings as open and fair. Too bad that our treatment of Indian folk to that standard could not always compare. So a toast to Jacob Leiser, a pioneer through and through. Our city's the better because of people like him, for me and I hope for you. Anyway, so Jacob Leiser was here. He opened a little store on Front Street, East Front Street, just down from where the First Interstate Bank is right now. By 1880, another fellow, two brothers actually came. Herman Cone, who was a Bohemian-born Jewish fellow, and his brother Leopold came, and in the 1880s is listed as his business. He was a harness maker. So he started out with the horse trade. That was, I'm sure, something important here in Missoula. But by within a few years, he had actually opened up a jewelry store. There was a store called Cone's Jewelers that ended up on the corner of Higgins and Front. That was in the original Florence Hotel. That hotel was burned down and rebuilt in the 30s. In 1954-55, that store was sold to the Stoveroods. So Stoveroods Jewelry was originally Cone Jewelers, and Cone Jewelry put up that clock that's called Free Speech Corner, because the Wobblies made it famous there at Higgins, right by the Florence Hotel, at the intersection of Front and Higgins. So there were the Cones. Irving Cone then took it over for his father. And he's the one who sold, see, this is 56, he sold the business to the Stoveroods in about 54, 55. But backtracking, Herman Cone was quite involved in civic goings-on here in Missoula. He was one of the 3 or 4 original businessmen who bought all this land for the cemetery. The idea was, he thought, well, Jews are going to be coming and we're going to have a pretty good Jewish population. He set about a quarter of this whole area aside for the Jewish community. It never materialized. There was never a need for it. So over a series of about 4 or 5 different transactions, that property was given to other groups who wanted the property here. But this little section here is there are probably 20, 25 gravestones at least in this general area, which is known as the Jewish section. Not all of them are Jews who are here. In the tradition, as a Jew, if it's a Jewish cemetery, only Jews are allowed to be buried there. You don't have them mixed, but being Montana and being the United States, that didn't last very long. So that was really the situation, and I understand that the Cones, especially Herman Cone, was quite involved in buying. He was involved in a number of the buildings downtown. He made some money. He invested in Missoula over the years. All that then moved on to others. But I understand he was an important businessman downtown Missoula. At the same time, by the teens and 20s, there were a few Jewish professors who ended up at the university. There was one in particular by the name of Louis Levine. It was a young economist, came here, and within his first few months, the Board of Regents asked him to do a study on the mines and taxation, to see what the taxation system was here in Montana. He came back and was pretty damning of the mining companies. As usual, they were not paying their fair share of taxes. Well, the mining companies just got in an uproar over this. And they applied all kinds of pressure to the university, to the Board of Regents, to get rid of this guy named Louis Levine. Louis Levine stuck to his ground. The faculty actually supported him and the administration, but the environment was just a toxic environment for him, and he ended up, after just 4 or 5 years, he left. And he ended up actually changing his name when he left here and became a writer. He wrote regularly for Atlantic Monthly and for various and more professional economic journals, and he changed his name to Louis Lorwin, L-O-R-W-N, but he was originally Louis Levine. There was another actually interesting fellow at the university he was the first PhD in journalism in the world, was a fellow by the name of Hausman, who ended up here at the University of Montana. He married a non-Jewish woman and wrote about it, and that was quite unusual in the 20s and 30s. He wrote a story that got quite wide coverage. It was called "I Married a Gentile," and talked about that. One other professor I think is worth noting, who picked up on this theme. I read this poem called "The First Jew in Missoula," and one of the professors became one of the most famous professors at the universities back in the 50s and 60s, or until the early 60s, was a fellow by the name of Leslie Fiedler. Leslie Fiedler was known as a literary critic, and he wrote a book called "The Last Jew in America," based upon something that took place here in Missoula, Montana. There had been a professor in the botany department by the name of Joe Kramer, Lithuanian born, and a fellow who was the last Jew. His friend, Sam Riven, had died back in about 1958, 59, somewhere in that period. Sam Riven, interesting story, came to Missoula after he had been a retail clerk in Hudson, New York. And the business that he worked for decided they needed to go west too and try to open up some businesses here. The first place they sent Sam Riven and family was Browning, Montana. They opened up a store on the reservation in about 1922, 23, somewhere in there. 3 kids, and they lasted about not even quite 2 years in Browning. It was just a rough place to be, as you can imagine, a family coming from New York. So Sam Riven moved his family to Butte. Butte was the big booming town. Still, they felt there were opportunities there. Their daughter, I think her name was Mary, had a little bit of a pulmonary and asthmatic condition. Butte was not good for that. The air in Butte was horrendous back in the teens and 20s. And so they decided they had to leave Butte. The next place they came was Missoula, Montana. So Sam Riven was actually the first, from what I can understand, person who really organized the Jewish community here. There weren't that many people, maybe a dozen families here in Missoula. But interestingly, they would get together for just a few major things. Passover is probably one of the two, that and the New Year, the Jewish New Year. But the Passover gathering is a family thing, so it's all men and women. Holidays for more ritual things tend to be just men. And another interesting connection with Montana and the Jewish community, there were several Grand Masters of the Masons here in Montana who were Jewish. Even here in Missoula, Montana, when the men would get together to hold a little service, usually for the New Year's, they met at the Masonic Temple, the building which is right east of First Security on Broadway. There, almost at the intersection of Higgins and Broadway. First Security, just east of that building. That building is the Masonic building. And the Jewish men would gather once or twice a year, have a little something. So that went on through the 30s and 40s. There were several important people here in town. It was sort of mixed between the university and the businessmen. And I'll tell you one other interesting little story. There was a business on Broadway called Big Broadway. I don't know if any of you are old-time Missoulians, but Big Broadway was like a dry goods store, just a general store where I think the new Safeway is, or maybe that older Safeway, right there on Broadway. He sold everything from dishwashers to electronics to food to hardware, all this kind of thing. Henry Silver came to Missoula in about 1929 after he had been a businessman in Philadelphia and his business mysteriously burned down. He had to get out of town. He ended up in Missoula, Montana. He became an upstanding citizen here in Missoula. But there were some curious things about the circumstances of his leaving. The only reason I know this is pure serendipity. I grew up here in Missoula, but I was gone for over 38 years. Most of that time I was in North Carolina, and there was a professor at the University of North Carolina who was related to Henry Silver's wife, Bessie Silver, and he's the one who told me. He asked me when he found out that I was from Montana, Missoula specifically, he said, "Do you know the Silvers?" Well, I said, "Of course I know the Silvers." And he said, "Well, I'm related to Bessie," and he pointed me to a source about Henry Silver having to leave Philadelphia. I guess he had been he had a successful business there, but successful, I think it was done for purposes because of the stock market crash or something, and he tried to collect some money, and so he ended up in Missoula, took that money and came here to Missoula, Montana. So I told you about Sam Riven. The only other couple people I think I will mention is this Leslie Fiedler and family were actually quite important to the Jewish community here in Missoula. His wife ran the Sunday school. There was no building, there was no really formally organized Jewish community, but they ran the Sunday school, and that kind of helped bring people together. The community would gather for a few of the major holidays. Passover was always a community event here. Purim is kind of like the Jewish masquerade, Halloween-y kind of celebration, and then the New Year's. And many times when I was growing up, these gatherings took place at the Fiedler House, which is now the Unitarians. They're at the corner of McLeod and Higgins. This Joe Kramer was a very interesting fellow who had come. He was Lithuanian born, came to this country in the teens, wandered all around. He ended up at the University of Nebraska, studied under the probably original ecologist. There was a Professor Weaver at the University of Nebraska back in the 20s who taught, his field was ecology. Nobody heard the name or the expression ecology back in those days, but Joe Kramer studied with him. He had wandered around the West, worked in New Mexico, worked for the Forest Service, but he got a teaching position at the University of Montana back in the mid-30s. Joe Kramer, and I'll sort of finish this with the poem my dad wrote about Joe Kramer. He was cremated. He's not interred here, but after he retired from the university, what did he do? He went down to the Job Corps in Derby and was teaching kids remedial math and English. So Joe Kramer was quite an interesting fellow. So they dedicated a grove of pines for him. So a grove called Kramer Pines. High up in the Bitterroot Valley, you remember from John Denver's song, there's a grove of trees called Kramer Pines. Please hear me, it won't be long. Joe Kramer had come from Lithuania in his 20s, still a young lad. After many a trying experience, wound up here, for which we're all glad. He taught botany at the U in Missoula in his fiery and colorful way, and many a forestry student can remember him to this day. Well, there aren't many left who still remember Joe. Sorry for this side. Smoky Joe was the nickname they gave him. You can guess the reason why. Though often enough he made them laugh, there were times they wanted to cry. Over the whole range of science and human affairs, with his old world scholarly way, they learned about plants, but much, much more, with his humor and passion, they say. But when speaking of a particular tree, Joe's lecture was worthy of note. He'd declare his concern for our own yellow pine. I can almost recite it by rote. Some call it bull pine or jack pine, he said, but its authentic technical name is Pinus ponderosa, he would state, and it's garnered a wee bit of fame. He rolled his R's for all they were worth when pronouncing that mouthful in class, and said, if I'd had a daughter instead, Ponderosa'd be the name of that lass. As it comes to all, Smoky Joe passed away, his love for that tree undiminished. But Bob Steiner, his student, as I, a colleague and friend, thought his story was really unfinished. His students were working throughout the West, many in federal employ, so the USFS really came through, their action a source of much joy. For if you happen to visit Montana, out of Darby near Painted Rock Lake, you may come across that lovely pine grove, a memorial for Joe Kramer's sake. Joe was quite an interesting fellow. He actually was my tutor when I became a bar mitzvah. We're supposed to read Hebrew. I was a terrible student back in those days, but he helped tutor me to get me to that place. So those are some of the people, but now there is actually the organized Jewish community. We have a building, Har Shalom, which is across from the YMCA on Russell. So thank you very much.